Hi. Those of you that don't know me, I'm DBW, and today I would like to take the Halloween opportunity to talk to you about haunted, ghostly, and occult metaphors in the discourses of privacy and cybersecurity. Now, that latter piece can kind of be sort of spread out to tech generally, but we'll try and keep it vague on topic. Rowena said we should do something fun for Halloween, and I said, no, let's do something terrible. And I have this idea that I've been possessed by. Then I realized we'd hired a lot of new people recently, so I'm going to look like this kind of crazed, forgotten relative who's escaped from the haunted attic of Trilateral. Um, but I do some serious work. But in this case, consider today's presentation my application to be your new defense against the dark arts teacher. Um, I hope to add a little. I hope to add a little menace. I hope to destabilize things, to celebrate the uncanny and the unnatural. So gather in, huddle close to the feeble glow of your screens, ignore the truly horrible things happening in the world outside, and if you dare, listen to this tale. I can't guarantee you'll be the same at the end of it, but isn't that always the price of knowledge? So, in my callow youth, before I started down this dark path, I studied political theory. I'm going to stop the accent. Particularly discourse analysis. And my work looked at discourses around surveillance technologies and in cybersecurity. Um, so this will become hopefully apparent in a minute why that's important. But I am often thinking about what we do at Trilateral. Okay, so what we're often trying to do at Trilateral is build better, more ethical, more socially relevant technologies, right? So, for example, these might be systems where people have a better understanding of what's going on, or where they can inform engineering or design choices. To do that, we're often trying to find ways to communicate the activities and natures of technologies and technological processes, or to understand the ways technologies are being communicated or spoken about, or find ways for people to express their concerns about the ways technologies are used and their negative social impacts, including like identifying when people have problems. Okay, but there's a problem with this. There's a challenge, and this is that it's hard to talk about technology. It's hard to talk about surveillance. It's hard to talk about data flows, algorithms, and AI and information technology more broadly. Okay, for a number of reasons. These are complicated things. They're created in a technical vocabulary which requires like technical literacy to understand. Um, we're talking about some quite complicated infrastructure. Many data and surveillance infrastructures that we want to talk about are very abstract. They're faceless. They're impersonal. They're disembodied, especially in relation to the older face-to-face social systems that they often replace. Many of the things we might want to talk about are deliberately invisible. Okay, so there's a commercial imperative for in technology design for smooth surfaces, reducing friction, creating opaque design, so kind of stuff that just works. Right. The typical example of this is the cloud. Right. You don't want to talk about the details of it, the fact that it's somebody else's computer, that it's massive mega scale computing infrastructure with colossal energy consumption. But no, let's abstract it away. Let's not talk about it. Let's hide it for commercial reasons. Okay, and generally, technology designers attempt to reduce the friction of using technology, right? To take it, it used to be the point that there was no distinction between essentially using a computer and programming a computer. Okay, if you were working at the kind of the basics of these things, you needed to know how they work to make them do stuff. And the trend for technology design has been to move away from that, right, to much more things that anybody can pick up and use. The glossy touchscreen surface of the latest iPhone, right? You touch it, you poke it. My kids can swipe around and do things. That's not because they're digital natives. It's because the thing has got the friction of use has been reduced. It makes things easier to use, but it removes us from the real workings of technology. And then we get into worlds where like nation state intelligence and security has always operated behind a veil of secrecy, right? And this also applies to its work to that work of those actors in digital infrastructures. Only occasionally do they break this kind of veil of secrecy with something like the Snowden revelations. A couple of years ago, wrote a paper on surveillance art, so artworks that were trying to engage with topics of surveillance. And so often they failed to capture what was really going on. They were very reliant on the surface appearance of surveillance, right? So depictions of the surveilled human body in physical space, missing the data, the flows, the impacts, the social effects coming from that. Privacy harms are, I think we've all found this if we've tried to do a privacy impact assessment or a data protection impact assessment. Privacy is hard to talk about privacy harms. They're often diffuse, they're statistical, they occur in some far-flung potential future rather than right now. This is why personal data is easily traded for convenience, cost savings, free products right here, right now. And privacy, our language around privacy is very often class-based, right? It's about threats to savings, property, bank accounts, reputation, future career opportunities, right? Which establishes and assumes an established, stable economic existence that really isn't the reality for many. In fact, there are limits to many of our kind of critical languages for pushing back against kind of utopian solutionist technology. I hope I don't offend everybody. No, in fact, I intend to offend everybody with this, because these are the things we kind of use in our daily basis, right? I won't go into the details here, but all of our critical languages for talking about the problems we might experience with technology have some flaws to them. Now, it doesn't mean we might be able to cobble something together from the overlap, but they all have some kind of flaws to them. So back to haunted things. I'm interested in how we can communicate in this space, right? And are there different ways of doing so? And the thing that came to my attention over the past few years while working on these things across different projects and thinking about these problems more broadly is I started to notice the regularity and spread of what I'm kind of tentatively calling haunted, ghostly, and occult metaphors. Now, this is a loose concept because it kind of has to be, right? I haven't done a quantitative study because nobody would fund me to do this. I can't say these are occurring more regularly or more regularly than other types of metaphors. You could study that if you wanted to, but there was enough regularity for me to sit up and notice. I had to check that it wasn't my own inherent interest in things kind of spooky that was making me see these things, but it might be. But as a discourse analyst by kind of training, when I see regularities, when I see patterns in language, I'm always minded to ask, what work is being done here? What kind of political work or otherwise is being done by these languages? These metaphors occur in kind of different ways. So sometimes you have like almost just a kind of explicit metaphor, and in other times you might just have what I call like a haunted style. I'll give you some examples and then you'll know what I'm talking about. So first and most classic one in cybersecurity terms or intelligence terms is this concept of the spook, right? It's a bit of a British tabloid one. British tabloids love to characterize people by strange versions of what they do. So I think we would all count as boffins in this context. But the spook is how they talk about spies, right, and intelligence agencies and stuff, right? It's a classic synonym for spy, capturing the secrecy, the otherworldliness, the separation from day-to-day life. There was a wave a couple of years ago of articles talking about haunted houses, right? Smart homes, hacked smart homes as haunted houses. Okay, so drawing on this metaphor of, your lights are going off, things are flashing, there are strange disembodied voices coming from places that you don't understand, just evoking this idea of loss of control, but also this invasion in the home. Right? So there's this language of people talking about smart homes in the manner of a haunted house. More on that. In fact, Sophos had a project they literally called Project Haunted House, which was about how to secure your IoT networks in your home. In the world of AI, we have kind of an AI professor here talking about IBM's Deep Blue and in comparison to DeepMind, an AI agent that can master a bunch of games. And he describes it by saying, its capacities, its abilities, by saying if your newborn baby did that, you would think it was possessed. So there's these kind of metaphors around alien presences within technologies or things behaving in unexpected or uncontrolled demonic ways. Then there's this term creepy, and I like creepy because creepy gets used to talk about technology, and there's a whole bunch of privacy advocates who will push back on you really hard if you use the word creepy to describe a piece of software or an app or something. I mean, we get some really grumpy, but there's these different things that generally here's how the scenario plays out, right? Some Silicon Valley tech bro startup creates an app which they think does something cool, but everyone else responds to and goes, oh God, that is creepy. So the kind of classic example here is this app Girls Around Me, which scraped social media data to show you where there were young women in your vicinity. Okay, like very stalkerish, very kind of weird. Over on the left of the screen, there's an open source intelligence tool that they have literally called Creepy, gathers geolocation information from online sources. So there's this terminology here of things overstepping boundaries, some kind of an activity that steps over a line, right? And we use this language that we would also use for kind of creepy environments, haunted houses, creepy feelings, right? There's kind of, again, these kind of like ghostly, haunted metaphors. Mozilla is using this language now, and they have a website where you can rate consumer IoT goods, and they talk about how their privacy policies work and how their kind of data protection exists and stuff. But you can rate it on how creepy you think it is, ranging from not creepy to super creepy. And then there are the companies that explicitly draw upon. This is more of a fantastic metaphor than a haunted one, but Palantir, purveyors of commercial governmentality that they are, explicitly draw upon a magic object from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, a seeing orb that you could communicate across long distances with and see other places. So there's some explicit people have dropped this on and use this themselves for their own thing. And just today, I saw, like 3 minutes ago, I saw this tweet that people are using holograms to resurrect dead celebrities. I don't even know what this is, but this looks just kind of creepy, so I threw it in. So, and there's a whole bunch of others we've heard of. We have our own concept of chilling effects, which evokes, in a way, the kind of the shiver down the spine, cold snap of being in the presence of a ghost. We'll talk about ghosts in the machine, possessed devices, zombie computers, trolls, data doubles, data shadows, and doppelgangers. All these kind of haunted, ghostly metaphors. I should contextualize this kind of field against two things. There's a tradition within media studies that's long drawn attention to the kind of hauntological dimension of analog media. So Matthew, thank you for pointing me in the direction of Jeffrey Sconce, who kind of argues that ever since the telegraph, ideas about the supernatural and technology have kind of intersected with each other. So we'd expect this to carry on with current technology. We've often thought of electronic media as kind of gateways to other worlds, and this even applies with kind of the early photography, where it was used to to try and prove the existence of spiritualist mediums and the ghosts they were summoning into being by kind of playing with this new medium to capture this supernatural thing. There's a great book here by Jill Galvin where she kind of looks at how the same personality traits ascribed nature that made young women suitable spiritualist mediums, so ideas around passivity, receptivity, communication, made them appear to be good operators for early kind of telegraph and telephone systems, right? So there's a fascinating little historical overlap there. And then there's a longer term association, of course, between magic, the occult, and statecraft, right? Basically through this idea of forms of hidden power and knowledge. So this is some stuff you can go and see in the British Museum, belonging to Queen Elizabeth I, court astrologer and father of English magic, Dr. John Dee. The shiny iPhone-like thing over on the left is an Aztec seeing stone of Dee's, which he believed allowed him to contact spirits, see across long distances, and talk to other worlds. Going too far down this path ends up in a kind of world of like Illuminati conspiracy theory, but let's not convince ourselves that there's this technological, political, rational world over here that's entirely separate from ideas about the otherworldly, the supernatural, or the haunted. So there's some examples and some context, which brings me back to the question of what work do I think is being done by these metaphors. Now, firstly, some of this is just marketing. Right, so as in the Palantir example, or the database company Oracle, right? They're simply attempts to advertise brand market technologies as being beyond the normal, right? Granting those technologies some kind of supernatural skill or puissance, right? In other words, people are using these for sense making. They're attempting to understand a new phenomena, an experience or a context by using concepts from elsewhere. So we're dragging in ghosts and demons to try and get a handle on what we're looking at. Sometimes it's being used for communication. So having got a sense ourselves, we're trying to communicate a new phenomena, experience, or a context to somebody else using familiar concepts from elsewhere. And then there's the one I like the most, the kind of the explicit attempts to unsettle our assumptions about technology. So we're calling that kind of abnormalization. You can't call anything denormalization anymore. The new weird fiction loves this prefix of abnatural, or abhorrent. So we're going to there are people out there who are actively attempting to destabilize our assumptions about how things work. Let's see some examples. So this on the left is a tentative list of some of the experiences that the use of these haunting metaphors might be trying to understand or communicate. So this is pulled from this book, Horror in Architecture, by Joshua Komaroff and Onkar Singh. And they're looking at buildings. They're looking at horrible, terrifying buildings that give you just nasty feelings. But they come up with this list of things that you might experience in a horror movie or read about in horror fiction, or kind of experience that you might want to talk about in this ghostly haunted metaphor. And they're things like strange doubles and copies, loss of self, strange intermediaries with other realms. And what we can do is we can overlay over the top of that a whole range of experiences and phenomena that we're likely to be more concerned with trilateral. So the work here is clearly metaphorical. Your hack smart device is obviously not actually possessed, but this summarizes some of the feelings involved in that experience. Okay. This is the bit that supports impact assessments, by the way, or stakeholder consultation, or user requirements. Any bit where you're trying to understand how people experience something, it's worth having this kind of, haunted mind to this. So, for example, if we're looking at, if people are talking about identity fraud, then maybe there's these experiences of loss of self to that. If we're talking about artificial intelligence, then there's this potential dimension, this potential register for speaking of non-human intelligence, alienness. Cultural theorist Mark Fisher gets this. He has these kind of two modes of thinking, two modes of perception that he thinks are kind of useful for getting a handle on the world. These are which he calls the weird and the eerie. And now there are two modes of perception typically found in horror fiction. The weird is all about that which doesn't belong. So it brings into a familiar setting something which ordinarily lies beyond it and can't be reconciled with it, or joining together two things which don't belong. So weird is what's a good example? Those kind of horror movies where there's a normal, very everyday setting, and then slowly you get this kind of creeping feeling that there's something not right, something has entered it. The alien invasion movies, anything where a nice, normal, everyday family has built a house on top of a ancient graveyard, any of that kind of stuff. The weird is a signal. The feeling of the weird is a signal that concepts and frameworks which we've previously used no longer apply. Right? The eerie is more about being caught up in rhythms of non-human forces. So sometimes this is nature, but sometimes this is just hidden forces behind our lives, right? I think there's a link here. I think there's a link here between these kind of weird and strange feelings through to back to privacy, in fact. So most of you, I think, will have some idea about this, but Nissenbaum's privacy in context is a theory about why people freak out about some privacy invasions and not about others. So Nissenbaum argues that people don't care about restricting the flow of information in IT systems inherently, but rather that ensuring that information flows appropriately. There are finely constructed systems of social norms or rules that govern the flow of information, personal information, in different social contexts. They define relationships, they protect people, balance the distribution of power, and evolve over time. And it's alarming when something flaunts these informational norms, right? So those norms, those concepts, those models of how we hold the world don't apply, or no longer apply, or shown to no longer apply. And that's seems very similar to the weird feeling that Fisher talks about. And this is useful because you've never ever heard anybody talk about their contextual information integrity being violated, but you have heard people say they feel something is creepy, okay, which basically is a stand-in for this kind of more legalistic, more philosophical thinking. I'd like to give you some examples of explicit attempts to do this kind of abnormalization work, this destabilizing thing. Now, he does use this language of the occult to talk about IT, to talk about computers. So he'll say things like, our computers continue to fight possession from forces beyond the wall of human sight. We're building our own spirit world by creating all these technologies. He advocates for a new cunning folk, right? So like he's using a metaphor about kind of spiritualists and shamans and things like this to sort of say people who are in communication with this other world, like intercessors between the physical and this luminous ether, conducting spooky action at a distance. He says, in a world of haunted machines we're determined to bring about, we need alchemists, people with feet in both worlds, people prepared to consider a world of ghosts and spirits with presence and agency, equipped to translate the high code of that world for the rest of us dung-stained villagers. He uses this code equals magic concept literally in his comic series Injection, where a cabal of futurologists supplement an AI with code taken from ancient magical texts, with the aid of this guy with the beard, who is the last descendant of Britain's line of cunning folk. The fairly expected result is they create an immaterial, alien, otherworldly entity, essentially Yog-Sothoth as AI. Another interesting person working in this field is Sterling Crispin. And Crispin has this work of art. He's an artist. And he has this work of art called Data Masks. And in Data Masks, he's created a series of what appear to be malformed or not yet human faces, also with 3D printed masks. So how he's done this is he's used state-of-the-art facial recognition and detection algorithms, and he's worked backwards from what these algorithms will recognize as a human face. So it's kind of the minimal thing. It doesn't look like what we would recognize as a human face, except in this kind of spectral, ghostly way. So we don't see this as a human face, but a facial recognition algorithm does. A picture of it. The data mask is a good example of a deliberate use of haunted metaphor. There's design choices here which exaggerate the spookiness of the artwork. For example, like the monochrome color, like this deliberate rhetorical effect. Oddly, he's now a prototype designer at Apple, so I don't know what that says about the world. James Bridle is another person working in this field. In this picture, he is trapping an autonomous vehicle inside a salt circle. He's taking advantage of the vehicle, it's not actually really a smart car, but imagine it is. It's programmed not to cross a white line, an unbroken white line, because that's part of the road law. So he's taking advantage of this programming to trap this car within an unbroken circle of salt, taking advantage of the kind of long-standing occult metaphors of the magic circle within which a summoned entity, be it ghost or devil, can't cross. It's a prank. It's not real, but it brings some of this instability, this kind of spookiness into play. He makes an explicit argument in his books that we need to develop systems literacy in order to understand our technological world. But to do that, we need to re-enchant our tools a little bit. My new absolute favorite in this field is Christine Ging's paper about her cosmic smart horror assistant, Egregore. Now, it's a design fiction, so it doesn't really exist. But if you imagine like a smart assistant, like a Alexa or any of those things, they are glossy, they are helpful, they have polite voices and all that kind of stuff. And Ging's argument is that that's a terrible way of thinking about these things. They're actually the manifestation of a planetary scale computing infrastructure, surveillance capitalism and all that just manifests in your house. And it does not have your best interests at heart. You can't understand its interests at all. So the much, much healthier way of representing these entities is in this kind of cosmic horror manner. So it doesn't cloak the fact that it's alien. That it doesn't cloak the fact that it doesn't pretend to be servile. It is alien. It plays on it. It looks horrible. It has glowing, flashing eyes. Things like that. To get it to do things, you don't say, hey Siri, you have to chant, "Egregore, hear me! I relinquish my very voice to you, O eternal collector." So everything about it is designed to kind of take away this smoothness, this kind of lack of friction, and add some back in and make you feel very, you should feel uncomfortable about interacting with these technologies. I love this. I think it's excellent. There are probably many more, and I'm going to try and collate them. If you come across any, please do share. But I guess this comes to the sort of fundamental question: are these haunted metaphors and these ghostly languages, are they useful for talking about tech, or are we just kind of off down a blind alley? Are there ways that we can use this kind of language to respond to people's demands for better technological design? This isn't real, right? We know these things aren't actually haunted. Is there a risk we look like pitchfork wielding peasants? Are we the paranoid dung covered peasants that Warren Ellis was talking about if we talk about this? I think it's useful. Okay, and the reason I think it's useful is that it's destabilizing. It's very handy if you want to unsettle or disrupt. But I think you need to wear that, if you want to play in this field, you need to wear that belief in ghosts very lightly, very kind of strategically. Otherwise people will think you're insane. But if, for example, you're writing a scenario or a vignette where you want to describe the potential negative impacts of or externalities of technology, then why not add a little bit of creep? Haunt that scenario slightly more. We need to be careful because there are, horror fiction particularly can be reactionary. There can be themes in that we don't want to kind of bring in with us to any of our work. For example, Christoph mentioned Lovecraft in the chat. I've deliberately steered away from things Lovecraftian because H.P. Lovecraft is a horror writer. You should know about him if you haven't read any. But he is a massive racist, and some of his horror fiction touches on miscegenation and bloodlines and all this kind of stuff, and we get rid of that stuff. But the stuff about otherworldly alien entities that don't have our best interests at hand is potentially quite useful. Is it enough? No, clearly not. I think this sits alongside those other critical discourses. All of them have flaws, but some of them are useful. I think we need to go beyond this. Okay, we need to go beyond this kind of haunted metaphors, and we need to maybe practice some digital exorcism. Right, so what does it mean to build non-haunted, non-spooky, non-alien technologies into the world? Okay, that is, I think, largely where I'm finishing. Although it is in the grand tradition of all horror, I leave myself open to a sequel.